Midnight on Earth podcast with your host, Jake Weaver. Engineered by Cedric Swan.
Hey everybody, we are back with another episode of Midnight on Earth. I'm your host, Jake Weaver, and we're here to bring you more knowledge, more light, and more love, and more incredible guests. Richard Kaczynski is on the show today, and we are going to talk about Aleister Crowley. And we're going to talk about his recent book about Aleister Crowley, which was written by him but edited by Richard. The Sword of Song, called by Christians the Book of the Beast. So we're going to learn a lot today about one of the biggest figures in esotericism, mysticism, and so many other things, magic and so much. But before we do that, I need you to do something for me. Follow me on Instagram at midnight_on_earth. That is the address. You can follow me there. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you go to get your podcasts, click that button that connects us so you know exactly what is going on instantly when somebody comes on the show to teach us about Aleister Crowley, which is so fascinating. Again, instant notification, and tell a friend, tell someone that you know that loves these type of podcasts. You know these people in your life. You know what we're doing. Bring them here, midnightonearth.com. Okay, so we're going to talk to Richard in just a second, almost there. But we just have to read his bio. So here we go. Richard Kaczynski is a lifelong student, international speaker, and writer in Western esotericism, and an authority on the life and works of Aleister Crowley. The author of Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley. He currently lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he is here with us today. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
You are here. Thank you. I super appreciate your presence.
Oh, I appreciate being here. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Well, I will tell our listeners, we had a scheduled interview. There were some technical issues that happened in this material world. Technical issues. We had to reschedule. So I feel extra special that he is here with us right now, talking about this book about Aleister Crowley. Tell me who this person is, because I know who he is, but many people still are unfamiliar. If you could just give us a very brief background of this individual, especially for people that have never been informed about him before.
Sure. And I would guess that just as many people who are unfamiliar with Crowley, there are also people who have probably heard a lot of tall tales about him and are perhaps laboring under some misconceptions.
Well, yeah, maybe we can clear some of those up today.
Yeah, maybe. And that's really what motivated me to write Perdurabo in the first place, because a lot of Crowley's past biographers constantly editorialized throughout telling his life story. So you knew, basically it seemed like they were trying to tell you what to think about Crowley, what to make of him. And I just wanted to put out the facts and let the reader kind of make their own decision, pro or con, or in between. But in a nutshell, Crowley was a product of the Victorian Edwardian era. He was raised in a fundamentalist Christian upbringing from a sect called the Plymouth Brethren, against which he rebelled in his teens and in his college years, and indeed for the rest of his life. And so it was that upbringing that kind of set the stage for a lot of his pushing back against the sort of religion that dominated, British society at that time, but also the drove his quest for something else. And he was also, he came from a wealthy family. And when he, reached the age of 18, he inherited the equivalent of about $6 million, was able to go off to college, Cambridge University. He outfitted, out of his own pocket, he outfitted, mountaineering trips. He traveled the world.
Right. I do know
And like he
that.
published and he discovered poetry and discovered he loved it and would, self-publish his own books until he burned through his fortune. And one of the
Wow.
things that he realized is while he was in college, he had been studying for like the diplomatic mission, but he came to the conclusion that none of this stuff of day-to-day mundane humanity survives. He thought, well, who could name the last ambassador to, some country? And he came to this conclusion that the only things that really endure and that matter are spiritual truths. And he devoted his life to pursuing that. And it started with him joining a British group called the Golden Dawn, which had as members people like William Butler Yeats and Florence Farr and Samuel Liddell McGregor Mathers and such luminaries of the of the arts and the occult scene, and that kind of launched him into his lifelong avocation or vocation, if you will, as someone who was promoting his brand of philosophy, which he called Thelema, and which he summed up in the phrase "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," which a lot of people mistake as being a libertine, do whatever you want sort of thing, but it's actually very, very different.
Well, isn't there a second part to that where it's love under will? I'm not remembering it
Yeah,
exactly,
love
but
is the law, love under will.
that's the second part of it. People talk about the first
Yes.
part, but they don't really ever, especially in a pop culture sense, mention that second part. And I think the second part is almost, well, maybe more important because what it's saying, at least from my interpretation, love under will. Whose will are we talking about? Are we talking about the will of source? Like love, if love is this greater thing and that's the will, love under will, and then do what thou wilt and harm none, including yourself and the planet perhaps, and other living things, that makes more sense to me. What do you think about that?
Well, Crowley was very clearly he wanted people to read his writings and his commentaries on the Book of the Law, which is where these phrases come from, and to draw their own conclusions. So far be it from me to kind of interpret that for someone else. But Crowley does talk about how the thou and do what thou wilt is not do what I want, is not do whatever I feel like doing. It is kind of referring to the same sort of thou that you hear like in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And it's not necessarily referring to the Christian God so much as it's referring to perhaps our higher self or our higher purpose in this
Exactly.
life. And it's in that sense that it's not, do whatever you feel like doing. It is kind of aligning yourself with your purpose and your goal and your unique place in this universe and being true to that and pursuing that while also giving other people the grace and the space to do the same thing. And I think that's a lot of where this love is the law comes from. To
Yes.
just not only do we have a lot to learn from each other, but we also, need to give people that freedom to become the best version of themselves as well.
Yes. And also, I would say it says that, or at least for me, I feel that it's okay to blow past low frequency, unnecessary restrictions. If there are things impeding love, if there are things impeding will in a way that's counterproductive to the progression of life, then, that's when you can kind of step over those things with your will.
Yeah, and that's kind of where Crowley's pushback against, a lot of the norms of Victorian society came from, because it was, in his perception, very suppressive. It's
Yeah.
dictating, who you could and couldn't love, what you could and couldn't write, and all these things. And he was just trying to open those doors, open those doors, push them open, and give people that freedom to be themselves.
So do you feel like, though, him coming from a wealthy family should have created a paradigm to where he was able to maintain that wealth? $6 million, that's a lot of money. I mean, how do you put it in bank? You're thinking interest, things like that, various situations. What happened that caused him to go through that much money that fast?
Oh, he was terrible with money. Because, he coming into that money when he did, at age 18,
18.
Wow. He came to appreciate, the finer things in life. I mean, he loved, fancy tobaccos and chocolates and things like this. He was a bit of a, gourmand himself. And, but at the same time, though, he was self-publishing his books, and he did really nice editions, but they really didn't sell. So he had like these a warehouse with all these copies of his unsold books in them, which now go for tons of money. But at the time he was just burning through cash printing these books. But again, he outfitted 2 Himalayan expeditions, and that's not cheap. Traveled the world.
He did gain experience.
Here's a perfectly good example. He was, in Scotland looking, at this time he was looking for a place to do the infamous, Abramelin operation, where you retire for 6 months and of constant prayer to try and get in touch with your holy guardian angel. And he came across a house in the Scottish Highlands, known as Boleskine. And he said, "I've got to have this house." And he knocked on the door and said, "I would like to purchase this house, ma'am." And the lady of the house said, "It's not for sale." And he proceeded to offer twice what the house was worth so he could have it. He was very extravagant.
In the moment.
And he obviously had to cut that back once it was all gone. But, his mom died. This is a little bit later in his life. He did have, a stipend that came out of that bit of his inheritance.
Okay.
And he had other sources of income that kind of forced him to get like a real job and do some writing and things like that.
Right. But that allowed him to take a spiritual path, to pursue those things with a little bit of financial security for a while. And during that time, he gained so much knowledge from traveling around the world, meeting these people that were similar frequency people and getting the regional knowledge and aggregating all of that.
Absolutely. And that's part of what is fascinating about this sort of song, because the kind of the background of that book is that the Golden Dawn group that he blew, that he joined, winds up blowing up. He just came in he was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Oh, wow.
And while people like to say, kind of point the finger at him for causing this was years in the making before he even came on the scene. And he just happened to show up in the middle of this situation. But the Golden Dawn blows up. He becomes kind of disaffected, and one of his main mentors in the Golden Dawn, followed by the name of Alan Bennett, to whom this book is dedicated, winds up moving to Ceylon to become a Buddhist monk. And Crowley decides, I'm going to go visit Alan. I'm doing some mountain climbing on K2 in the vicinity, so I'm going to spend a few months with Alan. I'm going to study with him. And so he was actually on site in the actual place where people, studied Buddhism and Hinduism, again, from the source. So not from, some secondhand book that he was reading in the comfort of his, British estate, but he was actually there, drinking from the fountain.
Right. Boots on the ground, as they say.
Yeah.
In a way, it feels like he's a man out of time. Like his energy feels more later 20th century versus where he was at in the time stream.
Yeah, I think a lot of people perceive him that way, and which is kind of why in the 60s and 70s, there was this renaissance of interest in Crowley, because it seemed like a lot of what he stood for resonated with, the counterculture movements of that era. And I think it might have been Israel Regardie, but I'm not entirely sure, so don't quote me on that. But one of his biographers, referred to him as, and maybe it was Robert Anton Wilson, but one of these people referred to him as like the first hippie, or a Victorian hippie, and I don't know if that's quite true, but it does speak to the idea that pop culture just kind of glommed onto him at that point, and he's since been more popular, in death than he ever was in his lifetime.
So he's studying, he's learning, he goes into the Golden Dawn. this book comes out originally, not the version that you edited. This is a beautiful, even more complete version with annotations and other things. But the book comes out, there's only 100 copies. Why is that? And where was that essentially in the history of his bibliography?
Okay, well, it's early in his bibliography. It's still pretty late numerically in terms of Crowley's poetry, but this is like the first book where he's actually starting to write a lot about explicitly about esoteric things. And I've called this as has the bibliographer Timothy Dart Smith referred to this as his first talismanic book, meaning a book with whose design, whose layout, and everything else about it is kind of a magical act, put out with a very specific intention.
Like hyper intentional, every aspect of it, the words, the way they look, the sentences, the rhythm of the words, the structure, the paragraphs, the page layouts, the rhythm of the chapters, every aspect of it.
Yeah, all the little marginal notes, the red ink and things like that. It's
everything was hyper intentional.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lavish book. I mean, it was on this big paper with gigantic margins, so it was not economical by any sense in the two-colored ink.
So talismanic.
One thing that Crowley does is that he prints these books, like, and again, it was in 100 copies, and but he had one that was like in blue wraps and one was in red wraps, and it was like the second edition, the third edition, the fourth edition, but each of them was like 20 copies. But the idea was, it's to convey this impression that this book is popular and is going through all these printings. It's kind of a marketing thing.
But now collectors love that stuff now, all this time later. They're like, oh my God, they drool over that stuff.
Well, there's, again, 100 copies. So they're...
And 5 of 20. Now you have to get one of each color.
Right.
But his information, he was getting downloads. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that at some point in his life, he connected with a spirit and downloaded or channeled this book of the law. But this is before that happened, this book specifically.
Just before, yeah.
But this is the first book where he refers to himself as the beast. And that became a very big thing that affected pop culture of that time, and then of course carried forward. But that's the first iteration, the first genesis of that.
Yes. And just kind of looping back to your earlier question about where this falls in time. So this is the book that comes out just before he has that experience of channeling the Book of the Law. It also happens just before he decides to publish his collected works, which comes out, it's all in poetry basically, but it comes out over the next 3 years in 3 volumes in this cramped, 2-column sort of layout. So you're talking about a guy in his, late 20s who's published and written enough poetry to fill 3 volumes.
Wow.
And it's also at this point where he has this revelation of the Book of the Law. And one of the things I find interesting about this sort of song is that you start to see some of the ideas and the language that is foreshadowing the Book of the Law, or which gets echoed in the Book of the Law. And it's almost kind of like you just kind of see his mind kind of like tuning.
Right. It's like a proto version. Like he's starting the downloads. He's piecing together the initial fragments.
Yeah. And you can look at this, multiple ways depending on your perspective. If you're feeling like this text is just kind of the expression of his subconscious mind, well, there's, you see how these phrases are coming together. But I think you could just as equally argue that if some other entity is trying to communicate something to you, they're going to use terms and language and concepts that you're familiar with. And so he's going to take advantage of what's most recently been percolating around in Crowley's mind. And these phrases kind of, either way you look at it, it kind of seems kind of natural that these phrases would crop up.
Absolutely. And then if you think about the fact that there's almost like a priming energetically, it's not like this linear experience. These energies are coming through in waves outside of time. These beings are outside of our linear time. So perhaps that's the beginning of it. That entity coming in, that's the first waves. And then as it gets more present in his life, perhaps then that's when it shows up in a more concrete way.
Yeah, and certainly Crowley saw that the events leading up to the reception of the Book of the Law kind of marked the beginning of a new era of mankind.
Right.
And, that he saw himself, or at least the Book of the Law declares him to be kind of a prophet, as if you will, of this new era. And Crowley definitely came to view the author of the book as someone external to himself. There was information about this book that he did not understand, that other people figured out
Right.
over years later and explained to him, that seemed to convince him that, yeah, this entity was something, beyond his comprehension.
Right. They reverse
And he
engineered
had a
it.
real separate existence. He kind of wrote that he was simply the stenographer,
Yes, I mean, I've had many channelers on my show, and there's very many people out there that connect with galactic entities, angelic entities. It's happened so much throughout history in what people would consider religious texts that it's definitely a part of our 3D reality experience that we're able to interface with these beings. And in a lot of cases, they have some message for us. They're connecting with the person for some specific purpose. And in this case, it was to give Crowley this book.
Yeah. That's, again, this, as you say, this is a theme or a modus operandi that repeats. I mean, you have, Carl Jung with his 7 Sermons to the Dead, even Edgar Casey, did the same sort of cycle channeling. Even like you get into more modern times, and you get like Seth Speaks and things like that, which is all these, supposed communication from, and other, spiritual entities. So it's, there is an archetype there for this phenomenon.
Absolutely. And before we get into that story, though, because I do want to enlighten people a little bit about what happened with that. For people that have never, ever been exposed to this information before, there are people out there, believe it or not, in esoteric circles that are just coming online, you could say, and they're learning and they're looking. Do you feel like your version of the Song of Song is the most complete version? So he released his original version, which was 100 copies. This is your even more complete version, edited by you. What was different? What did you add into it? And again, do you feel like this is the most complete now?
Yeah, I like to think this is the author's preferred text, because what happened was when he published his collected works 2 years later, Sword of Song was part of that 3-volume set, but he wound up making revisions to the text and also adding things to it, including some essays in the footnotes. It really gets kind of crazy. But I even though the collected works is in this cramped kind of 2-column format, what I did was I took this text, this revised and expanded text, and typeset it in the format that looked like the first edition, because they had that beautiful, again, that red and black type and the wide margins and all that. And so you could really appreciate the beauty of the book design, but have the benefit of his preferred text. But in addition to that, I went through some of his personal copies or copies of some of his friends where he had made marginal notes in the book and kind of incorporated that to kind of shed light on things that were kind of obscure in the book. I also went back to his original manuscripts and typescripts, which are part of the Aleister Crowley papers at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. And it's a fascinating document because you see how he wrote like the poems. He'd have this first initial draft, but then you'd see insert A, and A would be like 5 pages of additional stuff. And then he'd be scratching things out, adding things. There are pages where there's just additional stuff written all along the edges of the typescript where he's saying, insert this here. And so he was constantly adding to and expanding and revising the content of this book. And I thought it was really interesting to look at when different pieces of it were added, what are the layers of the book, but also to talk about, this is all like in the end notes, but to talk about, here's this verse that was there that he struck out, or here's this phrase that he changed to something else. And so someone who really wants to get into the weeds can really see the evolution of this book. And then finally, there's just a lot of stuff that Crowley never does explain. And some of this is really esoteric stuff. And some of this is just like current events that 120 years later make no sense to us. And so digging through either my esoteric brain or my historical research brain, wherever I could to help unlock what he's talking about, so that if you're reading this book and you go, I don't know what's going on, well, there's an end note for that.
Right.
And so the idea is to make this book more accessible to a modern reader, both from the historical standpoint and from the, Crowley's getting real esoteric here, what does he mean standpoint.
Right. Well, it's the definitive version, we could say, and has every aspect of it. But do you feel like any of the new information that you incorporated changed a meaning or changed something for you? I know it probably added overall, but was there something where you're like, wow, this now takes on a whole new meaning?
Well, certainly the deciphering of some of the esoteric stuff, because a good bit of it is, if you studied long enough, you can figure out what he's getting at. But there's a few riddles in there that have kind of defied decryption for many readers, myself included, for a long time. And figuring those out at last was very rewarding. But in general, kind of even the more obscure, like current events based things, digging into that history gives me a greater appreciation for the book. And interestingly enough, one of the other things that gave me another appreciation of the book was that when you're reading the first two pieces of Ascension Day and Pentecost, they're poetry. Crowley was modeling this after Browning, but he also was playing this game where he was trying to come up with like the most ridiculous words to find rhymes to. And so, there's this tendency to read it as poetry. He's great at the meter and looking at the rhymes. That's very entertaining, but that makes it very easy to kind of get lost in the rhythm and the poetry of it and the rhyme scheme. But when I was proofreading it, I had to kind of step back and say, no, let me read this as text, because there's words that, if you misspell it, it makes another word, so a spell checker won't get it, but it might not make sense in context. So I was reading this not as poetry, but as prose, just to try and find, wait, that word doesn't make sense.
Right,
is that
right.
or not? But reading it as prose was very, very different from reading it as poetry. And I would encourage anyone who reads this to enjoy it both ways, because it hits very differently. And that was a real enjoyable experience for me as I went through this proofreading process.
Wow, that's mind blowing, because like you're saying, you grew from it. You got to see it from a different perspective, a different lens, and there's a different type of information there. It's like a different dimension. You're like, holy, oh my God, I'm sure it was mind blowing for you. So after this, that's when he contacts the spirit. Now, Aiwass is the spirit that he contacts that gives him the book of the law. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then Lamb is one of the entities he encountered during that time.
That's a whole other thing. He has the lamb or the lam thing comes from a picture that he published some, I don't know, 15 years later, in his journal called The Equinox. And it was an illustration that accompanied H.P. Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence. And he called this picture The Way. And he said that, he kind of played this etymology, saying, the word, lam means, in Tibetan means teacher, what have you. And so there's been a lot of debate over what exactly this picture is. Some people have said it's a self-portrait. Some people have said it's, a picture of one of these secret chiefs, like
Right.
H.P. Blavatsky was in touch with, and other people say, "Oh, it looks like an alien,"
Right.
and I,
Could be all the above, honestly, in a way.
yeah, I'm a little more skeptical of some of the more out there interpretations, but because if you look at Crowley's work, I mean, I think the argument that it's a self portrait has some weight because there's other pictures where he drew a self-portrait of himself with like this weird exaggerated head and
Sure.
stuff. So, and there's other people who argue that it's, actually a penis joke. So, it's all these things are possible with Crowley.
It is all possible. However, I will point out, because we do cover the psychedelic world so much, that those grays, which in the ET community, LOM looks similar to the grays, but those entities also show up in the DMT community. The people that go out in these psychedelic journeys, whether it's with ayahuasca or with just the DMT compound itself, or activating the DMT in our brains naturally, they seem to contact those beings as well with the large eyes, with the giant heads. It's possible that that came from some experience that he had.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, there's no record of Crowley ever recording interactions or contacts with someone who resembled that. But I know that his secretary later on in his life, Kenneth Grant, um, really kind of believed that the the coming of the atomic age and the atom bomb kind of ushered in kind of like this this new phase of human evolution, and it's no
Absolutely.
coincidence that the atom bomb kind of coincides with the Arnold UFO stuff, sightings, and that's and all the stuff that comes after that. So, and a lot of this, Lam as an alien stuff comes from, Kenneth Grant and that Typhonian tradition. And, I'm, far be it from me to tell people, what they should or shouldn't practice. It's, do what thou wilt.
Right. But he did receive that transmission. Some people do confuse LOM with AWAS, or sometimes lump the two together if they're not very knowledgeable. And I do want to ask you about Crowley and Arizona in 1947. But before that is when he had his contact experience. Now, this was at the Great Pyramid in Giza, or near it. Is that correct?
Well, kind of, sort of. I mean, the way the story goes is Crowley winds up eloping with his best friend's sister, and they go on a honeymoon to Cairo, and she doesn't have a lot of interest in magic or occult or any of this sort of stuff. But they're on honeymoon, and he arranges for them to spend a romantic night in the king's chamber, in the Great Pyramid in Cairo. And while he's there, he does some invocation, and to kind of show, look, I'm a magician, and she's like, yeah, whatever. And later, they actually wind up renting a flat in Cairo, and he winds up doing this invocation again, kind of demonstrating, Crowley's magic, invoking the sylphs or what have you. And the second time, Rose winds up going into sort of this altered state or trance-like state where she starts saying, they're waiting for you. Horace is angry. We've got a
Right.
message for you. And he's like, what are you talking about? You don't know what any of this stuff is. And so, Grill, who's made a study of this stuff, starts asking her questions like, well, who is Horace? Who are his buddies? Who are his enemies? What's his favorite food? What's his favorite color? And much to its surprise, she's able to answer all these questions correctly. And so, as a final test, he winds up taking her to the museum there and says, "Fine, okay, point to me a picture of this Horace who you're speaking about." And as they're wandering through the museum, she points to this glass case across the room and says, "There, that's the one." And Crowley's feeling pretty smug at this time because she's walked right past a bunch of other pictures of Horace. But he goes to this glass case and he sees this funerary stele, it's like this wooden kind of tombstone-shaped plaque thing, and with painting on the face of it, and it does in fact depict Horus. But most importantly for him is that this object in the museum was exhibit number 666.
Oh my
And
God.
so he's like shitting his pants going, okay, this cannot just be a coincidence. And so he starts to listen to what she is saying or whoever is communicating through her, whatever she's channeling. And she winds up giving him instructions for doing a ritual, and then which ushers in this new age, the equinox of the gods, the age of Horus, the child, and then she instructs him to sit down in their flat at noon on 3 successive days, April 8th, 9th, and 10th, with paper, and to write down what he hears. And he describes her with his distinct voice over his shoulder from behind him, and he's writing feverishly for an hour. And each of those 3 days is one of the 3 chapters of the Book of the Law. And Crow didn't know what to make of this at first, and he kind of puts it away for a couple of years, and then he winds up stumbling upon this kind of set-aside manuscript in another kind of remarkable coincidence, and that finally convinces him that he needs to take this seriously, and he kind of, accepts himself as the messenger of this, new law for humankind.
Wow. I do remember elements of that, but that was a highly detailed story, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Now, I do want to ask you, do you feel like he took on that energy, putting himself out there as quote unquote the beast, aligning with the 666, which was always this number that was signifying something evil? Did he do that to essentially troll the people of the time? Like, he's thought that it was just so absurd, the rules, the way they perceived reality in a general sense, that he just mocked it and trolled it as hard as he could in that way.
I think it's a little of column A and a little of column B.
Okay.
For instance, when Crowley became the head of the Oriental Templars, or the OTO, he took as his motto Baphomet, which was the false god that the Templars were accused of worshiping and executed for historically, which is kind of a trolling thing, but at the same time, it's kind of playing on a lot of these Masonic conspiracy theories that were out there at the time. I mean, if Crowley was alive today, he'd probably, say, "Oh yes, I'm a lizard person, sure." But at the same time, there's a level of seriousness to why he chose that name, and he has like numerology and stuff to explain it. And I think it's kind of the same with the beast thing. When he was a little boy and he was acting up, this is, as is normal for little boys, his mom would get exasperated and say, you're the beast from Revelation. And he as a kid, that was like his favorite Bible, because it was scary and vivid and kind of cool. And so he was like, wow, what does that mean? But then as he got older, he kind of said, yeah.
It was almost like punk rock. It was just kind of like this rebellion of a system in a sense.
Yeah, and that's kind of where this whole idea of the sort of song is, called by Christians the Book of the Beast comes from. He's basically saying, I identify this name, this number, I accept this. But another thing to keep in mind is that while the beast and the number 666 have these associations with evil and things like that, this was not in the era of, Hal Lindsey and Damien the Omen and a lot of this sort of pop culture stuff we have today.
The Exorcist.
Yeah, exactly. And in the context of Crowley's Golden Dawn studies of magic, each of the planets in astrology, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and so on, and the sun being one of them. Yeah, it's not a planet, but from an astrological standpoint, it's treated as one. They all have numbers associated with them, and the 666 happens to be a number of the sun. So the number six is a solar number, and then so 6 times 6 is 36, and that's a solar number. And if you take every number from 1 to 36 and add them up, you get 666. So all of these are kind of extensions of the sun. And so he didn't see this idea of the beast or 666 as being evil or satanic or anything like that. He saw this as kind of enlightenment. He's like a messenger of a new era, and in his interpretation, Revelation was not, this scary end times. It was actually the story of the start of something new.
Absolutely.
If you're in the old world, is going to be very scary. But he's like, no, it's and there's a point where he was actually, in court, kind of defending himself against charges of black magic, and the prosecution's saying, what the hell? You call yourself the B666. And he says, well, if you don't like that, you can just call me Little Sunshine. And so he has this name that's just rife for misunderstanding, but it meant something very different for him. And, you can kind of think about that in the sense that, you've seen, pagans trying to reclaim the word witch.
Right.
Or feminists trying to reclaim the word bitch, things like that. So I think Crowley is trying to reinvent or redefine this term, but it also left the door open for a lot of misunderstanding as well.
And I'm sure he thought it was hilarious, people taking that aspect and then running with it. He probably thought that was hilarious. And in a way, he just let it go. Why fight back against people that are ignorant and low vibrational and, not to be judgmental, but let's just say stupid, right? Or why push back against that? You can't push back, so just let him run.
Yeah, and some of this was when people started calling him like the wickedest man in the world and things like that. I mean, he was broke on his ass. He was living in his commune in Cefalù, Italy, and didn't have the money to get back to England, let alone the money to hire a lawyer to fight back. And so he was just kind of like, what can I do? So it wasn't so much that he was relishing the attention so much as it was like, I'm broke. I can't take this.
Well, but was he a Freemason, though? Because you talk about the symbology and the things that he was tapping into, and later he's working with people that start the OTO, actually, and he joins that. But was he a Freemason in between that? Because I've heard that he was, and perhaps even made it up to the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite. But then I've also heard that he was for a while, but then decided to take a different path and did something different. Can you clear that up, actually?
Yeah, well, I'll try, but it's not simple. Crowley did join the Freemasons. This was when he was living in Paris, and he joined a lodge there. The problem with that was that the French Freemasons got rid of one of the Masonic, what they call landmarks. And in Freemasonry, there are like several landmarks that define what is Freemasonry, and these are non-negotiable. And one of them was the belief in the supreme being.
Right, exactly.
And the French Freemasons got rid of that. And because of that, the rest of the Freemasons in the Masonic world were not recognizing people who were initiated or raised, what have you, in France. So Crowley went through those degrees. And it was like an English-speaking lodge. A lot of expats went through the degrees at this particular lodge. Then he winds up going back to London. He wants to attend the lodge there. And they're saying, oh, we don't recognize you as a Mason because you joined the wrong lodge.
Right.
But then he winds up getting wrapped up in some of the esoteric Masonry, some of these other related rites, or what the historian of Masonry, Alec Howe, called fringe Masonry.
Okay.
So it wasn't so much the mainstream, Blue Lodge Masons or the mainstream Scottish Rite, but some of these other oddball things like the Swedenborgian Rite and the Rite of Memphis and Mizraim, or the Cerno Scottish Rite. And in those sort of more esoteric rites, he was given, again, the 33rd degree in the Cerno Scottish Rite, or, the highest rites and these other things. They weren't necessarily recognized by, the mainstream Masons, but there was this group of Masons who were very esoterically minded who all kind of made common cause together, and they recognized each other. So, yes,
Wow.
Crowley took the initiations and he was part of this movement, but it isn't something that would technically be recognized by,
Right, the traditional
the authorities,
Freemasonry.
the traditional
It's not
Masons. Yeah.
official. I think they call it irregular lodges or things that aren't a part of their official
Yeah,
Freemasonry.
irregular and clandestine. There's a
Clandestine,
few
yes,
terms for
that's the
things like
word.
that.
Yeah, and so that makes sense. I've been wondering that for years, and I've asked Freemasons about this, and they've been at a loss. But that makes sense. So he was a part of one of these either clandestine or irregular lodges and went through the 33rd degree there. Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
and Crowley kind of became opinionated. It might be the kind word, or bitter about this idea of jurisdiction, that you can take your initiations in one place, and in France, that's perfectly good and legitimate. You go to another country and you say, oh no, that doesn't count. And these ideas of who is or who isn't a Mason can get very complicated. There was a point in 19th century American Freemasonry where there were these two different versions of the Scottish Rite, and they were kind of going to loggerheads. And the Blue Lodge people aren't supposed to get involved in that stuff because it doesn't concern them. It's like, as long as you've got those three degrees, that's all we care about. And whether your lodge or this other lodge is legit, it's beyond my pay grade. But it got really messy until that was all kind of settled. So Crowley was also
Wow.
part of this idea that this idea of these what is and isn't legitimate is not as clean cut as it might seem to be. So.
And a lot of the French Freemasons were the ones that were the first to allow women into Freemasonry. I think it's called Le Droit Humain was one of the first versions of Freemasonry that allowed women, and that was in France.
Correct. And then Annie Besant, over in the England, also had a co-Masonic function led within the Theosophical Society and things like that. So then that was kind of pretty contemporary with Crowley as well. So,
Wow.
and then the idea of the OTO all along was that it was supposed to be open to both men and women, which again when that started was a very controversial and shocking thing. Because that is part of the Masonic oaths about who can and cannot join.
Right.
So kind of turning things on its head.
It's interesting because Freemasons, I've noticed it is male dominated. It's a fraternity, but I've been to a goddess temple in Ashland, Oregon. The high priestess there gave me a tour, but there were parts of the grounds that I couldn't go to because I was a guy, I was a male. So I don't know on that. I'm just not sure, but I don't think that women should be denied any of the mystery school knowledge that a man has access to. It's like God and goddess are here together.
Well, and that was true of the Golden Dawn where Crowley got started, and that was true when Crowley took over, as or became British head of the OTO and was basically getting it started. His first Grand Treasurer General, I believe, was Layla Waddell. The Australian violinist who had become his lover and was also involved in the magic. And so right from the get-go, Crowley's version of OTO admitted women. When he was in the U.S. a few years later, the lodge master was a psychic by the name of Mary Davies.
Oh, wow.
So all along, women have been part of Crowley's movement.
Did Crowley adopt some of the Freemason rituals into the OTO? That's been a rumor I've heard over the years that perhaps some of them were copied, or at least maybe the core aspects of them were mimicked in some way and then adapted into the OTO. Is that accurate?
I kind of, sort of. Again, I guess that bears some clarification too. There are elements of the Masonic rituals that Crowley thought were efficacious, kind of the way that things were structured or how things were taught during the course of initiation ceremony. They thought was useful, and he does wind up cribbing some of that, but the lessons and certainly some of the other things that happen in the ritual are decidedly different. So someone going through those rituals would not be taking a Masonic initiation. And again, we can come back to the idea of the landmarks. Being in the OTO does not require a belief in a supreme being.
Right.
So by virtue of that, um, OTO is not Masonic, and the idea is that while there may be some surface similarities, if you're a Mason coming through, you might say, oh, I recognize this or that, or this seems familiar or it's similar. The point of the ritual as a whole is going to be a very different experience.
Absolutely. And I've had people that have gone through some of the OTO degrees tell me that they don't know masonry, but it's radically different. It's like literally its own thing. And he refined it. Would you say he refined the OTO and their rituals?
Yeah, I mean, I think Crowley saw himself, and he writes this in his letters, where he said, I took these Masonic degrees and I threw out all the junk, because you've got like these, 90% of it is long speeches and stupid stuff that doesn't mean anything. It's all Bible stuff and blah, blah, blah. And I, pulled out the essence of it and then created this new thing with it. And I'm not, again, I'm not dissing Freemasonry in any way, but this is just kind of Crowley's take on it.
Sure.
And so he kind of creates something new, but using this sort of structure. And he did something kind of similar with the ritual he wrote called the Gnostic Mass. I mean, it kind of looks in some ways like, more conventional, Christian Mass. I mean, there's a cake and a host that gets consumed. There's a creed that is recited. But in the way I kind of describe the Mass is that Crowley took kind of this sort of outline, the structure, but he replaced the symbolism with what was sacred to him. And therefore, it becomes a very different ceremony. And it's the same thing with the Masonry. I know there have been Masons who have come to the OTO who are kind of interested because, and depending on the lodge you're in, the esoteric stuff may not be a consideration. People may be there more for fellowship. They may be there more for charitable works. They may be there more for, business connections and things like that. But there's people who are hungry for the esoteric interpretation. What does this mean? I have a dear friend of mine, once, who came to Masonry from the OTO, taking his initiations, asked one of these old guys who had been there forever, saying, "Oh, what does blah blah? What does this mean in this ritual?" And the guy said, "Oh, it doesn't mean anything. It's just symbolic," and it's like that's everything,
Right,
And so
exactly.
there are people who actually have sought out OTO, saying, "Wow, well, Crowley kind of gets into the meaning behind these symbols. I want to know what he thought to enrich my own experience."
Right. Because he did have a lifetime of study. He did have that ability when he was financially stable in his life and even afterward. Much like, I would say, Manly P. Hall. They had, in a strange way, a similar path. He was taken care of financially. He was able to study things esoterically and really put his mind into it. Did they ever cross paths? And what did they think about each other?
I'm not aware of them ever having met. I mean, Crowley has met some other like Rosicrucian type figures in the U.S., but I don't recall him ever coming across Manly P. Hall.
Wow.
Not that I know of.
That's so interesting because they are so similar in frequency and the depth of knowledge, the ability to convey that and teach other people, and also having the freedom to explore and travel the world and figure these things out in that era.
Yeah, there's a few people that surprisingly Crowley doesn't talk about or somehow missed or just doesn't talk about. One of them is Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was perhaps arguably the first American Rosicrucian who taught a version of sex magic, and Crowley was very much into that. So how he does not know or not talk about P.B. Randolph is a little bit of a mystery.
Interesting.
Another one of these people is Arthur Avalon, which is the pen name of Sir John Woodroffe, who wrote quite a lot about Eastern mysticism and Tantra. And again, they were contemporaries, and Woodroffe was pretty prolific in how Crowley could not have known about him is a bit mysterious to me as well.
Ah, wow. Now, we talk about ritual and Crowley's designing of these rituals. And when he brought his rituals to the OTO, he refined them with all the knowledge that he had previously. I mean, this guy had been studying, he had his contact experience, and he's adapting these things with that knowledge. Was he in a place of leadership within that community? Were there people of his era that were very aware of his knowledge base and what he was being exposed to and transmitting essentially? Because I know he had students, but
Yeah,
were there at least like was he respected by certain people of his era?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, it depends. I think there are people who, but again, like his students who really thought he had something to say, but there are also people who came from other schools of thought who were perhaps a little bit more put off by Crowley and his colorful reputation and things like that. Crowley was, you know, uh, did not make much of a secret of his bisexuality. And I think some of that, made people a little leery of Crowley, like in the Golden Dawn. There was, Yates wasn't specifically referring to Crowley's sexuality when he said this, but he basically said a secret society is not meant to be a reformatory, so he kind of thought that Crowley was a little bit wild for their kind of staid Victorian secret society, as it were. So, I think it kind of varied, but there's also people who certainly, respected him, like Dion Fortune, who's another occultist, was friends with Crowley and knew him, and even though they were kind of slightly different paths, they got on. There was a number of other occultists who could put into that category. So it varies. It's not an all or nothing sort of thing.
No, I am fascinated by Aleister Crowley because so many others are as well. There's something there. I mean, there are so many figures, you could say, in esotericism and mysticism that have contributed great works, but people really focus on Crowley for some reason. I know his work is very impactful for the people that study it, but what else is there? There's something else that's binding his energy to this dimension. What do you think about that? What is that?
Well, I think there's a few ways that's true. One is that one of the things that's kind of unique about Crowley is that because he studied with teachers, in the East, he was able to bring that knowledge and integrate it into that Golden Dawn system that he knew, and from that he created this new system, which he called the AA, and so while it's built on the sort of structure of the Golden Dawn, again, much as Crowley liked to do, he'd like to take these structures of rituals or organizations, but then fill that structure with his own thing. And he did the same thing, taking this Golden Dawn idea, but then adding all the yoga and stuff to that and creating this much more elaborate system that, the Golden Dawn system is really cool, but Crowley just, followed their lead of, well, let's connect tarot and Kabbalah and all these other things together in astrology. And Crowley's like, well, let's slap on this other stuff too, and create this, this thing. So I think that's part of it. That he's got a very comprehensive but at the same time very flexible system of study that you can either do in a group and in a teacher-student situation, or even as a course of self-study. Um, there's also, we shouldn't overlook the fact that toward the end of his life, he teamed up with the artist Frida Harris and created the Thoth Tarot, which is probably the second most popular tarot deck in the world, next only to the Rider-Waite.
Rider-Waite, yeah.
and they're very different decks, because the Rider-Waite Smith Tarot is kind of this nostalgic sort of, this quaint sort of deck that has this sort of Renaissance festival feel to it, whereas Frida Harris was very interested in modern art, and she didn't want to like retread that. She wanted to create something that was very future looking. And so there's a lot of modern art elements in this deck. And but it incorporates Crowley's lifetime of study and knowledge, and which includes the Golden Dawn color schemes and things like that for each of the cards, and scientific concepts and his own UPG and things like that. And it's again with this the second most popular deck in the world, and so that
Right.
imagery has become part of pop culture as well. And I've got a page on my personal website called Thoth Sightings where I track places where the Thoth Tarot has shown up in TVs, movies, comic books, album covers, and things like that. And it kind of shows that imagery is kind of pervading our consciousness. But also, I think part of the draw for Tooth Lehman for people who are interested in Crowley is the fact that he does have this sort of reputation, whether true or not. He has this reputation of being this bad boy,
Yeah.
this sort of, oh, I'm going to join the Golden Dawn and blow it all up. And but he experimented with drugs and the sex magic and this love under will kind of gets brought into the free love ideas of the counterculture.
Right.
And so I think there are people who are drawn into that for those perceptions as well. We get sincere seekers, but you also get like the edgelords who want to try and emulate Crowley, but it's never like climbing K2. It's the other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's the shopping mall version. But do you feel like he is the prophet of a new aeon? Like his information, what he brought into this dimension affected the greater hologram in a way that allowed us to evolve energetically, like prepped us for this new earth that's coming. Much like we were saying earlier, Revelations, I totally agree with that statement. Revelations is the beginning of this new thing that's going to happen for the human race. We talk about it on the show quite a bit because it's coming from various sources in different ways, but it's all saying the same thing, which is what he's saying. So do you feel that is accurate?
Yeah, I think Crowley's definitely tapped into the spirit of the age or the spirit of the coming age. I remember seeing Timothy Leary speaking at a festival in New York called Starwood. And he kind of talked about how the story of the 20th century was the story of the liberation of children. And he had this talk about how if you look at art from previous centuries, children are basically painted as small adults. They didn't actually look like kids. But then it was in the 20th century that we start to actually recognize kids as kids, that we have child labor laws and things like that. So it's the elevation of children and their liberation in the 20th century. And I couldn't help hear that, and think of how Crowley talks about this new era as being the era of the child. Not the era of the mother, Isis, or not of the father, Osiris, and kind of the slain and resurrected god, but the child who comes after.
Right.
And with that comes a certain amount of exuberance and change, but also some fiery energy. And, Crowley thought that things like the world wars that he lived through were kind of the manifestations of the old system kind of breaking apart to make way for the new system. And, as we see that the idea that Crowley was embraced by the counterculture in the 60s, I think does show that a lot of his thinking was ahead of its time.
Way ahead of its time.
Yeah, and was, certainly picked up, by subsequent generations. I mean, and even in academia, which is kind of, my wheelhouse, it's only been in the 21st century, really, that scholars have started to kind of look back and look at Crowley in kind of a serious, kind of academic sort of way. And, I really appreciate his influence on esotericism in the 20th and 21st century. So, yeah, I mean,
he had a massive influence.
We're still catching up to him.
Exactly. I mean, he had a massive influence. Again, I felt like he was like a man out of time because he had a more modern mindset, probably even more modern than we're at yet, where we're at in the time stream. And he was in that time looking around going, okay, I guess I'm here. I guess I have to do this. But then he did utilize his time in a way that was effective. Maybe some of it wasn't, but he created things that outlasted him. He created things that still have an effect on people to this day, not just his writings, but his thelema concepts and other concepts that he put out there, like you were saying, how it affects counterculture, still are pervading humanity's collective consciousness today. But I think that there's a little bit of fear around him because of some of the darker things that he was rumored to participate in. Without going into details or going one by one, can you just clear up a few of the big ones that are out there that you can think of off the top of your head, like child sacrifice, sexual intercourse in a ritualistic fashion with children, human sacrifice, animal torture? There are just so many rumors out there. This is a great time to clear that up.
Oh gosh, yeah, there's so many.
What can we do to shut all those down?
I'm just trying to remember the list of things you mentioned. He did not perform sacrifice of humans, children, or adults. There's a passage in his book Magic and Theory and Practice where he talks about the sacrifice of a child being the best, and how he looking in his diary, he performed this ritual 156 times a year. And what he means by child sacrifice is spilling his seed and not conceiving. And you couldn't come out and say that in print. And this is where it's kind of crazy, because it's okay to say, I sacrificed a child today.
Right.
But what he meant was, I jacked off and didn't make somebody pregnant.
That is hilarious. So people didn't realize the veiled coding that was happening there. And it's very slightly veiled. That's not too much of a extrapolation there. And then they just ran with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, he certainly was a practitioner of sex magic. He did not involve children in his sex magic rituals. He didn't. There's a famous story about a goat sacrifice, which is almost certainly untrue. That involved, Crowley's mistress Leah Hersig having sex with the goat, and Crowley slitting the goat's throat.
Oh my God! Yes,
at the moment of orgasm.
Right.
And the first thing about this is like, well, how do you know when the goat's orgasming? To cut its throat. But Crowley has a diary entry. I guess the idea was they're kind of read about like the Minotaur. Oh, the Minotaur happened because of someone had sex with a bull, and this was the result. So it's like, well, maybe we should try that. What have we got? Well, the best we've got is a goat. And Leah's like, well, all right, let's see what happens. But in Crowley's diary, he says, the goat wouldn't cooperate, so I had to step in for the goat.
And then people get so confused. I'm so glad we're clearing this up, because these are rumors that I've heard in esoteric circles. You have friends that are similar frequency, and they joke around or whatever, and these things come out. I've heard this for decades. It's still out there.
There's a story that Crowley made one of his students at the Abbey of Thelema, sacrifice a cat and drink its blood, and he got sick and died. And again, that's a story that his widow. So yes, this fellow did wind up dying, Raoul Loveday, but it wasn't from drinking a cat's blood. She was paid by the tabloids to tell them a whopper of a story, and she gave them one. What actually happened was there were certain springs near the abbey, or this place where their commune was, that was not clean water. And Crowley warned him, do not drink from this water. And he did anyway, and wound up getting dysentery, and he died from that. And the widow, Mary Butts, who told this cat story to the press, years later when she wrote her biography, Tiger Woman, tells a very different story. And her story there is the dysentery story, where Raoul Loveday got sick and died.
She finally admits it, essentially.
Yeah, but it's the cat sacrifice story that lives on, even though it's not true.
Well,
So
since we're clearing up misconceptions, I have just two more I want to ask you about, actually. There was two that I wanted to ask you specifically about. One was the ritual in Roswell or near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, just before supposedly he died. He did a ritual out there prior to the Roswell UFO crash, prior to the nuclear tests that were happening there. And some people suggest that that ritual opened up a portal which allowed these Roswellian extraterrestrials to come through. And then on that same note, there was another rumor that he opened up a portal at Loch Ness near the time of his death as well, and left the portal open because he didn't close it prior to graduating to the next dimension. What do you think about that, and what are your thoughts on those two?
well, the first one's really easy because Crowley was never in Roswell, New Mexico, nor did he ever do a ritual there. So that just didn't happen.
Okay.
After about 1929, 1930, he settled in England. He became bankrupt and never left the country. The OTO members in Southern California, which was the only active lodge in the U.S. in the last years of his life, were actually trying to bring him over to the U.S. so he could kind of live out his life, surrounded by, his adoring fans. But that just never happened. So Crowley
interesting.
was,
No, we're clearing up things
there.
that have been around for decades. Have been
Yeah.
around for decades. But what about the portal at Loch Ness?
I mean, what I think this is about is that it's this Abramelin ritual that Crowley was doing at Boleskine, which is the house on Loch Ness. And the idea is you're doing this 6 months of magical retirement to get in touch with your holy guardian angel. In
Right,
the middle
we're
of
talking
the
about
ritual, the head of the Golden Dawns, McGregor Mathers, summons Crowley back to London to kind of help him deal with the rebellion going on in London, and then the London Golden Dawn. So Crowley comes to his rescue. And I don't know, there's some idea that because he didn't finish the Abramelin operation, ghosts still run around to this day. But I don't know. I don't put a lot of credence in that. I mean, part of standard ceremonial magic practice is when you do a ritual, you banish to start with to kind of clear your space, and when you're done, you issue a license to depart. So whatever you may have attracted goes away. I think there's some of this may come out of this this movie called A Dark Song, which it's kind of this occult movie that seems to try to portray the Abramelin operation, but my understanding is that the director or the writer didn't actually want to depict the real thing, so they kind of made up some stuff to kind of stand in for the real thing.
Got it.
But there is this idea that once you begin, you cannot leave the house ever, or dire circumstances will befall you. And I think that's part of it. I've heard people say, yes, the Loch Ness Monster didn't exist before Crowley
That was
did
Crowley.
the ritual. And, like, come on, man.
He seemed very enlightened, though. Like you said, he was a wild man. He did kind of imbibe in various things to alter his consciousness and travel in these dimensions. But ultimately, he was doing it for a purpose of growth, for humanity, for service. He did serve himself at certain points, sure. But ultimately, he did have that overarching goal, that higher goal of just bringing in more knowledge.
Yeah, and I guess that's another opportunity to dispel one other myth that's pretty persistent around Crowley. Is the idea that he was like this lifelong drug addict, and or heroin addict. And the thing is that and when Crowley was about 45 years old, he was suffering from terrible asthma. This is something that apparently is pretty common with mountain climbers of that era, because you're going to these very high altitudes and they didn't have oxygen tanks and masks at that time. So you're putting your lungs through a lot of stress. There were people on that K2 expedition who got altitude sickness on that climb. So Crowley was having asthma really bad at this point in time in his life, in his mid 40s. And at that point, one of the treatments for asthma was heroin. And so it was legally prescribed to him as a treatment for asthma.
Right.
Just a few years later, so as we're talking 1919, 1920, and around 22, 23, the Dangerous Drug Act passes and heroin becomes illegal. And Crowley, yes, he was addicted at that time, but his access to it became restricted, and he wound up kind of going cold turkey. And it wasn't until much later in his life, his late 60s, after going through all sorts of other medications and treatments for asthma, that once again England was allowing prescription heroin use for asthma to be doled out on a prescription basis. So it's just in the last few years of his life that he was back on heroin, but it was medicinal. And so a
Right.
lot of people like to paint this, again, to denigrate Crowley and say, "Oh, he was a lifelong drug addict." And it's like, well, he was on prescription medications so he could breathe, and it was for two very short periods of time in his life.
Yeah, I always perceived it as being an explorer.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly did. He explored like peyote. He claimed
Right,
to have
right.
introduced peyote to England. That may or may not be true, but that was certainly something that he explored in a big way. So
Yeah,
I don't want to
psychedelic
discount
pioneer.
that stuff either, because he certainly was, a psychonaut or an entheogenic, pioneer for sure.
Absolutely. Now, you talked about the sex magic. Did he have any children? And are there people claiming to be his descendants today?
There are people who claim to be his descendants, but there's not a lot of proof. There's a lot of people who claim to be his reincarnation as well. But
I'm sure.
he did have a few children. He had two children with his wife Rose, with whom we talked about with the Book of the Lost story. One of those children died very young, but the other
Right.
one, lived a long, full life. But because they wound up, Rose and Aleister wound up divorcing, and Rose kept custody of the daughter. Obviously she didn't want anything to do with Aleister, either because of his colorful reputation or because of things that she heard from her mom and her brother and her uncle, um, or what have you. But anyway, they were estranged, and he did wind up having a child through a woman named Patricia McAlpine. Gayer Randall, but Crowley called him Alistair Ataturk. And he lived a long life, and actually had a
Interesting.
grandson. Crowley had a grandson through him, but they have both passed as well. And he also had a child through Nanette Shumway, who was one of the Scarlet Women, or participants in Crowley's Thelemic commune in Jefallu, and she had a child and a grandson who actually still does live today. But
Oh, wow.
so
Because you think about those experiences, I mean, perhaps they have an effect on DNA. They have an effect on a person's DNA, their auric field, that genetic memory that somehow carries on in biology.
yeah. I mean, and this, I think, I know it's not my place to speak for his grandson here, but I think he kind of sees it as kind of a mixed blessing. It's kind of like, oh, that's kind of wild and cool, but at the same time, it's kind of like, wow, that's also kind of weird.
Well, what if you had a talent for magic? Like, like perhaps, you think of a guitar player, incredible guitar player's child, they have a knack to play guitar. Perhaps that lineage has a knack for magic, and perhaps one person might come out of that lineage someday and reemerge in that way.
Yeah. I mean, and again, there may be other children he doesn't know about, but not that we know either. I mean, Crowley got around, shall we say.
Right. No, exactly. Well, do you feel like there's a Crowley of today or anyone that really holds that frequency?
I don't know. I mean, Crowley is kind of a unique figure, and I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about him is that he really is larger than life. I mean, he wasn't just an occultist; he was an accomplished poet who again, he wrote poetry for his entire life.
Right.
The last book he published was, kind of an anthology of his favorite poems from 60 years of being a poet. He was again, the mountain climber. He supposedly was a secret agent with the British intelligence
Yeah,
service,
MI6, right.
or at least MI5. Yeah.
Or,
um, and so on, and that he was an artist. That's any one of these things. He could play blindfolded chess with multiple people and beat them all. It's just so many things that he was good at, and to be good at any one of those things would be a satisfying life, and yet he was just remarkable. Good, bad. That's a value judgment, but he was certainly remarkable in a lot of different fields, and to do all of that in one lifetime is something else. And so I think I have a hard time finding anyone who kind of matches that sort of just immensity, of
yes.
life.
And people are still talking about him all over the world. Millions of people to this day, even us right now, we're having this incredible conversation. It has been an incredible conversation. If Crowley were around today, what do you think he would think about this modern world, the technology, how what was considered very rare spiritual information is available at the touch of a finger at a millisecond speed of light? How do you think he would process that, just based on your studies and being a biographer and getting into his mind?
Oh man, he'd totally be on TikTok. I tell you. He he wanted to make movies about magic, educational stuff, and so it's kind
Okay.
of cool for people out there doing that now, because that's totally what he would be doing.
So he'd
Trying
have
to
like the
get the word out.
modules. He'd be on, he'd have the internet school of Thelema. He'd have the modules. You could learn from him. You could take mentorship, coaching, all of that. But he did that work for us early on. He was there as a trailblazer of a new frequency that has ultimately changed the world, because it's influenced American culture, which then influenced other cultures around the world. And now we're here decades later, still, as we were saying, influenced by his work. So one more question about Crowley before we go, and we'll talk about your book a little bit more. On his deathbed, it's rumored that he said something about perhaps having regrets about some of the things he did. Is that valid? Were there stories about his deathbed experience and what he recounted?
There are a couple of stories out there, and it's one of those consider the source sorts of situations
Okay.
where he's come from biographers who are historically who've been kind of hostile toward him. And so one of the stories that you hear is that his last words were, "I am perplexed." Another one of the stories you hear is that he said, "Sometimes I hate myself." However, we do have the testimony of Pat McAlpine, who was the mother of his child, Gare Randall, or Alistair Ataturk, who was at the bedside when he died. And he had kind of slipped into unconsciousness uh, the day before, and she was there at his bedside. And when he finally passed away, he did so silently, and she said there was a clap of thunder in the distance, as if the gods were welcoming him. And
Wow.
I kind of put the weight in that story, because she was actually there at the time, as opposed to these other versions of the story, which are
Hearsay, essentially.
hearsay. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Well, thank you for that. And this book, The Sword of Song, again, is the most complete, the definitive version of this book, collecting various sources related to this book, early writings, annotations, all of that, and putting that into one volume. A beautiful, beautiful volume, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, it's got the red and black ink throughout. I mean, it's a big sized book with a slipcase, and it really is a chance to kind of get a snapshot of where Crowley's head was at in terms of the Golden Dawn and Buddhism and agnosticism and all these things he had been toying with, and even his views on Christianity. just before this big revelation of the Book of the Law happens. So you kind of see the starting point of the revolution that, Crowley was going to create.
So if you're a student of Crowley, definitely check this book out. This is going to blow your mind. This is going to add new information into your Crowley lexicon. But this has been an incredible interview. Thank you so much, Richard, for your time. This has been so good. And I actually went outside of time. I was like hanging on your every word. Like, this has just been incredible. But before we go, and we'll have you back on, believe me, we're going to have you back on. But before we go this time, is there anything that you feel like people should know about Aleister Crowley that they don't know, that you feel like they should really understand to really grasp the depth of his character?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would say is that, again, there's this perception that Crowley was kind of a con man or a shyster, a publicity hound, and none of those things are true. Crowley did not make money. He did not retire rich because of any of this. In fact, he spent his fortune trying to get the word out, as a teacher or as a prophet. And even after he ran out of money, even after he was attacked by the yellow press and the tabloids, after they were calling him a man we'd like to hang, the worst man in the world, the wickedest man in the world, he never wavered from what he saw was his mission in life, was to spread this word, this teaching that he was given. And he was 100% sincere in that pursuit. And, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but know that that's true of him. And if you want to know more about Crowley, read one of the better biographies. I could recommend mine, of course, but there's a few others out there. But get want something that's written a little bit more recently. Not these early 1950s pot boilers, and just get the facts
right.
And make up your own mind. But I think it's indisputable that this guy was a bigger than life figure, and whatever you want to say, he stuck by his guns. He walked the walk. And he. His whole life, he never strayed from that mission.
Yes, and it was all rooted in love, ultimately, all of it. The various understandings, comparative religion, studying all these esoteric concepts from around the world. He integrated it, but always having the foundation being in love, right?
Yeah. Well, for him, the Greek words for will, for thelema and love, agape, numerically add up to 93, which kind of makes them sort of, if not equivalents, at least kind of connected ideas. So
right,
love
similar
and will
frequency
kind of go together for him. Yeah.
Wow. Well, okay. Well, we're definitely going to have you back on. We can just keep going, but
Sure.
Thank you so much for being here, Richard. This has been an amazing, amazing interview. The Sword of the Song, called by Christians the Book of the Beast, is available everywhere that you can get books. Richard-Kaczynski.com. I'm going to spell that for you. RICHARD-KACZYNSKI.com. Go there. You will find out all of this information. And wow, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for being here, Richard.
Oh, it was a great talk. Thank you for being such an engaging speaker to interact with.
This is just the beginning, my friend.
Oh, yeah. Well, new book coming out in October. So
well, there we go.
Stay in touch.
Please hold through the outro music, and everyone else, check out the book, check out the website. We have taken the deep dive into Crowley for the first time ever, over 250 episodes. And this is the first time. So thank you for being that for us, Richard. And everyone, we will see you next week. Midnight on Earth.